Hi, it's Mark Evans, and you're listening to Marquee Spark. Let's talk about something that's transforming how companies build trust, reach decision makers, and stand out in a sea of sameness: video podcasting. For years, podcasts have been a go to content format, but the game has changed. YouTube has emerged as the number one discovery platform. Thumbnails have become mini billboards, and the smartest B2B brands are turning each episode into a month's worth of high impact content. In this episode, I'm joined by Sergey and Joe Newton from Sway One, who recently published a comprehensive report analyzing 75 plus B2B video podcasts, from bootstrap startups to global enterprises. They break down what the top shows are doing differently, why executives should absolutely be hosting your podcast, and the biggest mistakes companies make when they hit record. If you're thinking about launching a show, revamping your current one, or want to understand how video podcasting fits into a modern B2B content strategy, this conversation will give you a front row seat to what's working and what's next. Let's dive in. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mark. Great to be on the show.
Let's start with the big picture. Why has video podcasting become such a powerful tool for B2B brands right now? And how is it different from traditional podcasting or content marketing?
We've seen the trend of platforms going into video. More people consume video. It started with TikTok. It probably started before TikTok. The video was the format that a lot of consumers preferred to get their news content, and podcast couldn't be left behind. We've seen that more shows prioritize video. And that means when we started with podcasts, a lot of them were audio only. People were uploading to YouTube sometimes, and they had artwork and just an audio, and there's nothing happening. But because the new video era coming and LinkedIn pushing videos quite hard, especially recently, having a video when you're recording a podcast made a lot of sense. Now we're seeing more podcasts, not just recording an interview in the video format, but they're also using short videos. They're creating trailers. They're creating mashup sequences from an interview. The viewers want that. It gets much more engagement, and because it gets stronger distribution. Those are the primary factors based on the trends.
From a discoverability point of view, YouTube is so much stronger than the dormant Spotify podcasting platforms. It gives the host, the podcaster, a lot more reach, but also it's much easier from a consumer's point of view to find and discover new podcasts and new shows, new episodes when it's on YouTube. That whole discovery phase of discovering a new show, discovering a new episode, finding a cool episode with a cool guest, it's just so much easier on YouTube. Whereas on Spotify, you already have to know a show exists to search for it. That piece is just so different on these older podcast platforms.
It is interesting. A lot of the podcasts that I listen to on a regular basis are now heavily promoting their YouTube channels. Some of them, for example, Pod Save America is putting content exclusively, or at least they're doing special content on YouTube that you can't get in the audio format. But it is interesting to see the pendulum swing from audio to video. It leads me to my next question. Your report shows that YouTube outperforms Spotify and Apple Podcasts for podcast discovery. The $64,000 question is, why do you think so many B2B companies are still ignoring YouTube as a primary channel?
Just as a quick response to that, so you'll have a great answer here as well. But I think it's a black box. YouTube, for a lot of B2B marketers, is this scary channel still where it's seen as a black box.
It's a cultural and mindset things. Those are the hardest to overcome because YouTube has been treated in a certain way for many years. Why would it be treated any differently? YouTube is treated by B2B companies as almost like a hosting platform. You put it out and then you can embed it on the website, and that's how it was. Why would it be any different? Typically, B2B companies are notorious for moving a lot slower and making changes. Another factor, what Joe said, and one of the really key ones, is expertise. YouTube requires a lot of expertise. It requires a lot of understanding how it works. If you're not investing a lot of time into it, then it's just a very surface level understanding. We're going to upload the video. We're going to put the thumbnail, probably repurposed from a webinar. Then we're going to put a title similar to what we put on the website. Not enough time have passed and not enough expertise for companies to view YouTube differently. But that is starting, thankfully, to change because of this massive discoverability algorithm and the fact that YouTube accounts for 60% of searches on Google. And the most important thing, and we will talk about it more, right now, majority of B2B search terms are open. Nobody occupies them. If you put videos with your industry terms and somebody searches for them, you will be number 1, number 2, number 3. That is free. At 60% of Google search, that means people search for you. They will find that video. They will find that piece of content. How much companies right now are spending on paid? A lot. Right now, this is free. If done correctly, this is free for now. It could be up for grabs. A lot more folks need to look at that, and we could post general numbers that this is available. Start making this change.
Joe, let me circle back on your comment about YouTube being a black box. Many people from the outside looking in see YouTube as a very user-friendly platform. Video is accessible. Why is YouTube a black box? What don't people or B2B marketers understand about YouTube? What are the biggest mistakes they make when they approach YouTube? And as Sergey said, they simply see it as a hosting platform.
I think a lot of it stems initially from no one really knows what success looks like on YouTube. There's no kind of, at least I've not seen any stats. There's no like industry benchmarks of what does a good view count look like? What does success look like? What does the downstream funnel metrics look like from YouTube? It's when you think of YouTube and B2B, and we reference these guys all the time, Ahrefs, and I think probably Slidebean or another good example, but there's like virtually zero examples of B2B companies that have made YouTube work. I think a lot of it just stems from no one knows what good looks like, so that's a problem, but also there's a perception barrier in people's minds, but particularly marketers, right? When they look at YouTube, they look at Mr. Beast and all of these massive, big consumer creators. I think it, in a way, scares them off, and it makes them think, oh, do we have to go to that level to make YouTube work? If that's the case, we have no idea where to even start with that. I think it's benchmark and then also this perception barrier that exists.
You make an interesting point because you could argue that podcast analytics have been a black box for years. If you looked at the way that many B2B companies assess the value of their podcasts, you could say subscribers or downloads or maybe conversions, but I don't think that was a metric that was valid. A lot of marketers leaned into brand awareness or the fact that they could take a podcast, particularly with video, and they could repurpose it into blog posts and LinkedIn and Twitter. The way to quantify the success of a podcast was part science and part art, part numbers and part guessing. How do we establish, as marketers, how do we establish benchmarks for the success of podcasts, both audio and video?
I think it's so unique. It may not be an industry standard or an industry benchmark that a lot of marketers are looking for. It may not exist. It doesn't often exist with top of the funnel content that is purely brand, that is difficult to attribute. Some of it is about the views and subscribers. Some of it is around relationships. Some of it is around things that are happening behind the scenes that you cannot see. What kind of benchmark we could put behind it? It's very difficult. There are probably some numbers that could be put together, meaning if you're getting 100 views on LinkedIn, and if you're in this B2B industry, that's pretty good. But that is also very relative and could also be proven wrong, because if you're getting 100 people from outside of your target audience, that benchmark is completely irrelevant.
Let me be devil's advocate, because in my world, ROI matters. Everything is measured. We live in front of our dashboards. If you're a B2B marketer and you say to your CEO, I want to do a podcast, and they respond, that's great. How do we measure success? And you say, there's no benchmarks. It's really hard to quantify. But believe me, it's going to be a good thing, because we're going to do the podcast, and then we're going to take all this video and we're going to cut it up into clips, and we're going to rate blog posts and link posts, and it's going to be great. It all sounds good. Podcasts can be a valuable asset. But at the end of the day, if I'm looking at making an investment in a podcast and I'm the CEO or the CFO, and you as a marketing leader can't tell me the ROI, I'm going to be very reluctant to give you the green light. But obviously, a lot more companies are leaning into podcasts. The question is, are they a leap of faith? The management team saying, yeah, okay, you can do it. I'm not sure whether you can measure it, but it sounds like a good thing.
Mark, you're right. That's a good point. But I was actually answering only very specific question. I was only talking about industry benchmarks, not the justification for the podcast. So there's a big difference between what am I going to get as a CEO versus answering the benchmark parts. Because what you're going to get, it's not that difficult to quantify. You're going to get certain relationships built with your key accounts that you're looking to sell to. That's one. Two, you are going to get very strong distribution with your ICPs over LinkedIn, over website, over YouTube, over email. We're going to get sales enablement assets in the hands of our team. We're going to get a lot of really high quality value content pieces that right now the content team is working on. That's not super difficult to justify, and those will be seen. How we're going to track that? We're going to look at the views. We're going to get the reaction. And we're going to ask our audience that's following us, and in a sales conversation, how did you hear about us? What do you think about the podcast? It's not going to be necessarily that difficult to track. Now, it's not going to be based on Google Analytics. There's not going to be this mega chart, but it will be trackable and it will be justifiable. That is one of the reasons a lot of B2B companies are running a podcast, and they will be running a podcast, and they're looking to invest more. But specifically about industry benchmarks, that's slightly different.
I'm going to be the bad cop here and suggest that a lot of the things that you suggest around quantifying the success of a podcast are what I would call soft metrics as opposed to hard metrics. If I'm a marketer and I'm very data focused, I'm looking at conversions, I'm looking at all kinds of KPIs. What you're suggesting is you can create some content, you can ask customers what they think. And it all sounds really good. I love podcasts. Don't get me wrong. I'm a big advocate for the power of podcasts and their ability to spawn lots of great content. But the measurement tools are not super focused. I'm not going to look at a podcast dashboard and go, oh my God, look at these arrows going up. Look at these arrows going down. How do you justify that?
What's important, and just to double tap on it, and maybe this isn't the hard data metric that everyone's looking for, but this is why that when we talk with clients, the first things we speak about are guest relationships that turn into clients. That's a really critical thing for a lot of clients that we work with, is that the podcast has becomes a very good tool to invite key prospects, invite key partners. That's a really clear metric that we lead with. What a lot of execs and founders care a lot about now is building a personal brand, because they realize the value. And what we've seen is that a podcast is the best way to enable you to build a personal brand. It's a really frictionless way to create a lot of content to position your exec as the key man, key woman in the industry. It's starting with the things and the outcomes that really matter to them. If we can show over a podcast that we've been able to convert 20 guests that have been in the show, 5 have converted into key accounts, that's a key metric for a company. So it's leading with things like that.
Let me switch gears and put on my good cop habit and say that there are lots of marketing channels that cannot be quantified in a very specific way. I'm working with somebody and we're leading it hard into radio ads and billboards. You can't directly measure the success of a radio campaign or a billboard campaign. You can measure how many cars drive past a billboard, but you can't measure the impact. You can't correlate billboard viewage to actual activity unless you use some specific URL. There's lots of ways that marketing can be measured and lots of ways that it can't, but they're all part of the marketing mix. Let me shift gears. You mentioned the role that executives and the C-suite can play in not only justifying the existence of a podcast, but as your report suggests, the role that executives can play when they host a podcast. Once that jumped out was that podcasts with executive hosts get 6 times more views. Why do you think that executive or expert-led hosting is so effective? Why are many companies still hesitant to put their leaders on camera?
Because they have the best thoughts. It comes down to that a lot of the time. Not always, but in most B2B companies, the founder, the exec, the C-suite, they have the leading thoughts in the industry. They have definitely the leading thoughts for their company. They own the narrative. They understand the narrative, likely better than anyone else in the company. By nature as well, not always the case, but founders, even if they're quite introverted, do tend to be good storytellers and communicators. I think it's a combination of those two things, but most importantly, they have the substance and the thoughts. We've seen over the years a lot of podcasts inside companies that have been started by the marketing lead, the marketing manager, the content manager, which they tend to not perform too well because fundamentally that person doesn't really have the insights and the expertise to be able to drive a conversation for 30, 45 minutes.
I'd also suggest that one of the weaknesses of executive-led podcasts is they're not good interviewers. They're good leaders.
It could be.
They're good talkers, but they just don't know how to shape a conversation. I've spent 30 years asking questions as a reporter, podcaster, marketer, I know what questions to ask. I know how to drive a conversation. Of course, I'm blowing my own horn, but conversations, interviews are hard. You have to listen. You have to be prepared. Sometimes it's a skill that you don't have or you have to learn it.
You could have executives in an interviewee role or in a host role, which is a demanding and difficult one. But if you have them on the show with somebody else, that works well too. You're totally right. The role of the host is extremely difficult. It's very hard. And not a lot of executives could do that. But if they are acting as a thought leader who knows a lot and it's great to listen to, but they're not necessarily moderating the conversation, that's a good format.
One format we've seen work really well, particularly with execs, is more of a co-hosted commentary style, which we've mentioned in the report. It's not necessarily where there's someone interviewing anyone in particular. It's just two co-hosts that are talking about it's something that's happening in the industry. And it comes across more of just a conversation between two people versus just like the typical podcast interview style. It's also understanding the format that you're using and not always going to the interview format if you're using an exec style host podcast.
I want to follow up on that. Joe, you mentioned in terms of formats that podcasts using multiple formats, interviews, roundtables, commentary, have nearly 2 times the virality. What would you give advice to companies that are stuck in that single format rut?
Don't go too crazy too early. Walk before you run. We always say this when we chat, when we talk to clients. There's like a podcast scale of difficulty, right? On this end, you have the standard. Interviewing is very hard, but if we're just running a very simple question answer interview, that's probably at this side of the scale. And then we have on the other side a narrative based podcast that's really difficult to execute. I'd say take it in steps. If you're currently running an interview standard show, which is what most companies do and have been doing, introduce just every couple of episodes a panel or introduce a co-hosted, bring on your exec or bring on your CEO or founder and just do a more of a co-hosted style for an episode. It's slowly introducing it. I'll give you an example just to make it a bit more tangible. Over a year ago now, we were working with a company called SeedTag, and they're in the ad tech publisher space. A lot of the episodes we were doing initially were just interview. Dal, the host, he was like the VP of partnerships for SeedTag. We were just doing a lot of interviews and that was the typical style. Slowly over every month, we started to introduce just basically a state of the industry episode. So we'd bring on someone else in SeedTag in the company, and it would basically be this co-hosted commentary style where they talk about something that was happening in the industry. I remember one episode, it was the whole Barbie and Oppenheimer thing. We had a whole episode between 2 people inside SeedTag talking about it. And it wasn't as much of an interview. It was just 2 kind of people who are friends talking about something that's happening. That's a real life example of what it looks like.
Okay, great advice. I wanted to talk to you about frequency. A lot of companies that launch podcasts, do a bunch of episodes, they launch the podcast, they publish weekly for a very short period of time, then it's bi-weekly, and then it's monthly. Then you look at the podcast and it hasn't been updated in months. They've lost their enthusiasm and maybe resources or just trying to find the right guests. They run out of steam, and that's just a recipe for disaster. I wanted to talk about the ideal cadence for a podcast. And you're finding that publishing bi-weekly actually delivers better engagement than weekly episodes. It's a classic less is more approach to marketing. Why do you think that less frequent publishing wins? How should teams balance quality versus consistency?
Ideal cadence is the one that companies can maintain. This is the most important thing. If you could maintain the cadence, this is the right cadence. This is a really good way to think about that. In the report, the fact that bi-weekly shows do better than the weekly, just quality, preparation, quality, production, quality of conversation, quality of assets that are created after that, slide decks, short clips, things like that. It's done better because there are more resources that have been spent. The reasons that companies are abandoning their shows is because they have not been clear on, or they didn't quite understand the process. They don't have somebody who is clearly communicating the expectation, and they did not define what that looks like. What is this experiment? How long is it going to last? 6 months. Let's see how many episodes we can do. Let's see what resources do we need. Let's go and get it done. A lot of times it's just, let's see what happens. It's a very dangerous thought. If we are treating a podcast as an experiment, every good experiment needs to be defined when it starts, when it ends, and what does it look like. If a company is doing an episode and it gets 0 results, which is very unlikely. If it's done well, then let's stop. But most of the time it's because the expectations have not been defined, the cadence have not been defined, and their production and time requirements from the team have not been properly discussed. This is a very common thing with executives when they say they will do it, but then actually they don't because they don't have the time.
We talk a lot in the industry about the one-page marketing plan and what that should include, but let's look at the one-page podcast strategy plan. I'm a company, I want to launch a podcast. I need to make sure the key elements are in place so we're all aligned in terms of what we're doing, why we're doing this, what success looks like. What would that one-page podcast strategic plan look like? What would need to be on it so that the C-suite and the marketing department and the sales department all aligned on how to move forward?
It will need to include the most basic things. How long are we going to do a podcast? At least 6 months. How many episodes can we produce? What is the simplest way to get started? Like Joe was talking about, that we don't go too hard into experimenting. Who's going to be producing it? How we're going to distribute that? Who has enough time to actually be on the podcast? If this format that we are defining right now, let's say we're doing an interview with guests, if this format doesn't work for some reason, it takes a little bit too long, what is the other format? What is the contingency option? Which is given the fact that it may not work exactly the way you expect. The podcast concept may not work exactly as you expect. Is there something else we could do? But it's about the production. It's about the production requirements. It's the frequency. It's the theme of the show. It's the concept of the show. It is who's going to be a part of that, who's going to be producing it, what would be the calendar look like, the key points of making it happen, and the timeline. How long are we going to spend before we actually get ready to launch? Then after we have launched, what we're going to do, what will be the set of actions, who's going to be doing them. Probably not going to fit on a one pager, but with AI, I think we probably should manage.
One absolutely critical thing to nail up front is the general and overarching theme. If you look at most B2B podcasts, this is where it really is missed. You want to be careful with a theme because you don't want to box yourself in too early. To Sergey's point, there's going to be experimentation. We might not just stick to one format. We might have to shift from an interview to something else. You don't want to make it too boxed in from day one. How I've always viewed the power of podcasts is a really good way to share your company's point of view and narrative, right? What you don't want a podcast to turn into is something where, particularly if it's an interview, where the guests just drive the narrative and the conversation, which is what a lot of podcasts turn into. I think being really clear up front about what's the overarching narrative and theme. If we are going to pick guests to come on, do they align with that like narrative and theme, right? I always think about that with our podcast video that we run for Sway. I'm not going to invite someone unless they clearly align with how we think about the industry and the types of topics we want to talk about. I think just being very clear with that up front and not letting the podcast divert too far away from that clear theme. In my opinion, that's where it goes wrong with podcasting.
We've talked a lot about strategy and goal setting and quantifying success. I want to spend the last part of this conversation looking at the mechanics. Let's get in the weeds. You mentioned earlier in the podcast about the fact that a lot of marketers don't understand YouTube and the way it works when it comes to podcasts. In the report, you talk a lot about optimization, titles, metadata, thumbnails, timestamps. What does a fully optimized B2B podcast episode look like? What are some of the simple steps that brands can take to quickly improve their current setup?
We'll assume that we could improve the previous episodes that exist, plus we'll improve the ones that are coming up. What should they improve? Thumbnails and titles. Those are two of the most important things on YouTube. They need to be optimized. When we talk about the title that is YouTube, it needs to have a certain structure. It needs to have a certain point, strong opinion, capturing attention, and it needs to have some industry terms you could rank, as we discussed earlier. And the thumbnail is YouTube optimized. A lot of B2B companies use titles from a webinar or from banners from LinkedIn, and they put them on YouTube. Usually people are very small. There's a lot of text that nobody reads. That's not good. There's a lot of good examples on YouTube of thumbnails that we could use. There are a few podcasts that do well on YouTube. Taking them as an example, applying that design language to a company is good. And typically it means a very simple style of the thumbnail. B2B designers like to overcomplicate things. One thing you need for YouTube is actually remove that complexity, because the whole purpose is for people to click on it. They're not going to stare at it like a painting. It's not for that. The other part is fundamentals. Trailer. an intro, something that captures attention, something that has a sequence of highlighted moments at the very beginning. That would be really nice. That's nice to drive, to get people in. And then when the interview starts, is preferably, it doesn't start with a predictably boring part of tell me about yourself, tell me about your job. It starts with a little bit something more interesting. So there's a little of that structure, if it is one person interviewing another person. And then there's a summary, there's an outro that summarizes the conversation or gives CTA to people of, hey, go to this place. It's one end card strategy, meaning that you're directing people to another piece of content after they finish watching this one. That could be another episode. It could be something else, but one, just one specific, not two, not three, just one. And then description, title, description, and you also have the timestamps with square brackets. They really help a lot with navigation. Doing these things actually make a substantial difference on overall optimization of the channel.
With YouTube, always working back from existing performing content that's already on the platform. A lot of B2B marketers, not just with podcasts, but with YouTube, with content they generally post on YouTube, they've not worked back from what's actually already working and what's already ranking. I think just spending the time to look at existing performing content in whatever industry or category niche that you're in and deciding to do a few episodes around those, as long as they do fit within what you want to talk about, I think it's smart just to kickstart the algorithm and make sure that you are actually going after what people want to watch.
If a company has a podcast, there's a couple of options. One is you go to an agency or a podcast specialist and they do everything for you. They produce it, do the thumbnails, the meta tags, the whole shebang, and that's great. If you're trying to do a podcast yourself, if a marketing team has the mandate to do everything in-house, aside from YouTube as your distribution channel, can you recommend tools that B2B marketers should be using for recording, hosting, creating video clips, captions, anything in your toolbox that you could recommend?
Obviously, the platform we're using right now, Riverside, use that for recording. The only thing I will note is that, and Sergey will definitely mention this, is that it's always better with podcasts to record locally for quality purposes. Like even if it's a virtual recording, generally it's better to put in a bit of extra work and just record locally on the iPhone. The quality is going to be better and you're not going to face any issues that can happen, as we know, occasionally with these platforms. In terms of tools that I'd recommend, there's things like Descript, which can be incredibly helpful for pulling transcripts. I would be careful about when things like clips and things like assets that you're creating from a podcast. I think there's a really cheap way to do it, which feels great. I've got 50 clips now that I can post on LinkedIn, I can post on Shorts, and great, amazing. That's great, and that works. But I think for most teams, they would benefit from actually putting a bit more effort into some of the creative for the clips from the podcast.
What we'll say on Opus, and this is perfectly normal, this depends on how certain companies think. And when they create clips on Opus that get 1 to 2 likes, let's see how that goes for a few months. Well, we can chat after that. My point is that you have an interview, and interviews are already quite a diluted piece of content. They're not super well choreographed because it's just a conversation. When you're cutting out certain pieces, they need to be really good. These are really good. It's not just about, oh, I put this piece of content in the feed and that's success. Not really, because we want to have consumption. So it needs to be a really good one. Just important to consider. We could use AI tools like Opus. Maybe they do a little bit of help on picking the moments, but we haven't seen a lot of success on that. But it's just about whether this piece of content will be consumed or it's just going to be ignored.
That's the critical part of podcasting for a company. A lot of companies and vendors, people in the space have pushed podcasting as a pure efficiency play. You do a podcast, you get 50 pieces of content off the back of it. Great. But if they're not being consumed, there's no exactly an efficient use of resources.
How good are they? Because we talked about it on our episode that we could do 1,000 clips. That's awesome for like the next 12 months. But do they deliver? Like the quantity is great. They could be done at like a cheap cost, but do we really care about the cost? We don't really care necessarily about how much it costs. Is there an outcome that you could present to the CEO, to the VP of marketing and say, hey, this actually contributed to this pipeline?
I've been doing my podcast for 4 years and my go-to tools have been Descript, which is amazing for transcripts, captions, clips. I clip everything myself. I don't rely on the robots to do it for me. Recently, I switched over to Riverside from Zencastr. Zencastr used to be a very simple, clean tool. And as they added more features, it got increasingly complex and less user-friendly. I couldn't figure out how to use it anymore and switch over to Riverside. So far, so good. There's some things that I really love. Great tools can save you a lot of time and money. Final question, looking ahead, this is the loaded question, the big picture question, where do you think B2B video podcasting is going? What innovations or trends are you most excited about over the next, 12 to 24 months?
More companies will spend a lot more time really thinking through the actual podcast structure and content. They will bring in experts or even hire internally and spend more time on how do we actually make the conversation itself more engaging, the storytelling of it, working on training the hosts better. I think the podcast itself is where I think we'll see a lot more quote unquote innovation. Companies will try and just improve how do you keep someone hooked from the start? How do we just get better at moderating the shows?
The YouTube fundamentals of creating engaging content that hooks you in, keeps you engaged, and gets you to do something will be applied much more to B2B podcasts than ever before. Because so far, before and now, a lot of B2B podcasts have just been created. The first step, it's done, it's created, it's published with not much regard to fundamentals of the content consumption and how people consume it. Do they click on it? Do they stay engaged? Do they really like the conversation? How's the theme? Is the guest related to this whole situation? Maybe it's not even a guest. Maybe it's something else. A lot of these things have not been done, and the learning curve is high, and it's understandable. But we are going to see more principles of good content that are not that different to Netflix or movies. Virtually every YouTube creator who's successful will use this. It will be applied to B2B podcasts. And we're going to see that probably shorter episodes, more variations on formats, more engaging, more fun to listen to, better produced, certainly better produced. That's going to take a bit of time. And obviously YouTube, it will be on YouTube. It will be better optimized because right now you could occupy your niche with industry terms for free. It's a great time to start.
Final question. Where can people learn more about you, Sway, and get their hands on the report that you just published?
Follow both of us on LinkedIn. The report is on our new Video First resource hub on the site, which again, we can have the direct link for after this episode when it goes live. So people can go and check it out. Really in-depth report. It's 30 pages. There's 10 unique insights that we gathered within it. I think for anyone starting a podcast, actively has a podcast in B2B as a marketing leader, I think it will be really valuable.
Thanks, Sergey and Joe, and thanks to everyone for listening to this episode of Marketing Spark. If you enjoyed the conversation, subscribe by Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast, and leave a review if you like what you heard. Marketing Spark captures the stories, insights, and strategies of B2B SaaS founders and marketing leaders. I'd love to hear from you if you're a CEO, entrepreneur, or marketing leader with a unique perspective or an interesting journey or story to share. You can connect with me on LinkedIn or visit marketingspark.co to get in touch.